Well, good morning, everyone. John chapter 9's been of interest to me for a little while now. I've really enjoyed just thinking about it. The Gospel of John is, I've heard some people say it's a little more spiritual. I'm not sure about that, but he does seem to at times be a little enigmatic. There's an element of mystery and intrigue in the way he expresses things. And his stories can sometimes be, I believe, sort of multi-layered. If you dig a little deeper, there's always something a bit further down. And so in John chapter 9, you've got a fairly simple account, as we've just had read to us on the surface. There's a man who was born blind, who's healed by Jesus. Jesus just comes along and covers his eyes with mud and sends him off to the pool of Siloam. He's then presented to the Pharisees and is rejected by them. So a fairly simple narrative. But John leaves us with some extra questions hanging over this account. And I believe when we consider these queries, the account opens up a little more fully, leading, I believe, to a better understanding of what discipleship entails. I wanted to firstly have a bit of a look at the setting or the context for this account. And we have, this is the city of Jerusalem in AD 30. It's, we'll just open this up here. No, it's not going to do it for, oh yes it is. Oh, no it's not. Yes it is. Oh, Don't worry, I'll use this fella here. Here we have, actually in the pinky sort of colour, you see that's the original city of David, and it was extended from there by Solomon up to cover this green area here. So Solomon actually increased it a fair bit, but it was a fair bit smaller back in those days than it was in the time of Jesus. If you have the orangey sort of colour around here was a further extension, which was well after the time of Jesus. And today it is out around this sort of area down here. If we have a look at the walls in the time of Jesus, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. Here we have a second north wall, and there's the first north wall. So in the time of Nehemiah, I believe, this was opened up here. And where it says second quarter, it's not talking about 1/4 of the area. I know Jerusalem today is divided into 4 quarters, but the word quarter here has the alternate meaning of a residence. So we say that someone might return to their quarters. Okay, so this is actually the second residential area that was established in the time of Nehemiah. So you've got the temple area here. When the Romans were there, they occupied much of this, the upper city, which was sort of like the wealthy side of town. You had Herod's palace here. There's a Hasmonean palace there. There's a theatre down here. And they actually built a hippodrome in this area here because the Romans really loved their horse races. So this part of the city was predominantly a Roman area. We've got a number of pools around the place. This one at the top here, the pool of Bethsaida, the pool of Israel here near the sheep gate. There's another one down here called the Towers Pool, and another pool down the bottom here, and the pool of Siloam down here. So it's interesting that all of those pools are actually outside the city walls. Okay, so the story as it opens up in the previous chapter, Jesus is just leaving the temple precinct, presumably going back to the residential area over here. So I think that actually plays a little bit into the context of this story. Also, as part of the context is the fact that it was a Sabbath. So anyone that's been to Jerusalem on the Sabbath, they'd know that there's not too many people walking around. It's almost a deserted city on the Sabbath, except for those people who travelled between their homes and the temple area. So there was just a few. They could only do this because of that ruling of the Sabbath day's journey. The Sabbath day's journey is an interesting little thing. It's only referenced once in Scriptures, I think in Acts chapter 1, verse 12, where you have Jesus' disciples returning from the Mount of Olives back to the city of Jerusalem. And it says they travelled about a Sabbath day's journey. Most references say that's about 2,000 cubits, or about 900 metres. So it's a bit less than a kilometre. This was, the origins are a little bit sketchy, but it appears to be a rabbinical ruling that they could actually travel outside of their homes on that day. The original law, if you look at the original law, the Mosaic Law, bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That's why on the sixth day he gives you bread for 2 days. And everyone is to stay where they are on the seventh day. No one is to go out. So the law was that nobody leaves their home on the Sabbath day. It's interesting that the legal get-around was to actually arrange for some provisions to be stored in a tree or by a tree 900 metres from your home, and then you could travel to that and declare, this is now my home, and that meant that you could travel another 9,000 metres. So the distance is, it's a little bit like travelling from North Terrace to South Terrace, I suppose. It'd be a bit less than that. It would be about maybe half that distance. That's about a mile. So we're talking about somewhat less than a kilometre. So it'd be not very far, really. Okay, so into that context we have this blind beggar. And the blind beggar's location, I believe that probably if he was living around this area, it'd be quite a reasonable suggestion that he was begging somewhere around this area here, which sort of agrees with Jesus returning from the temple area to the residential area. And if in fact the beggar was living around this area here, he would have not wanted to travel very far, and he would have probably wanted to be on a path, on a road that led to the temple, because that's where pretty much all the foot traffic was on the Sabbath. So it seems logical to see the beggar somewhere along this way here, and the narrative reads, as Jesus passed by, or as Jesus was walking down the road, he came across this beggar. The advantage of the beggar being there, of course, is that there'd be more foot traffic there that day. He'd get a little bit more by way of donations. There was probably several beggars along this piece of road because it would be a popular bit of road to try and attract a little bit of income. And it was probably, if you think about it, would have been too difficult and of no benefit to him to have travelled any further than that. So he probably never really went very much further than that area. The other thing that I think is interesting to consider is that people that are born blind almost inevitably have very good hearing. So there's not really much doubt that this man would have heard Jesus coming down the road with his disciples, and they're all chatting away. And as they walked along the path towards him, they would have passed other beggars. But Jesus chooses this man and stops in front of him. So this poor guy, I think he would have probably felt maybe a little bit awkward, because he would have known that Jesus had stopped in front of him. He would have been aware of that. And he was now the focus of this group of people's gaze. They're all standing there looking at him. Maybe he was a little bit apprehensive. Were they going to abuse him? Were they going to rob him? Maybe they're going to give him a donation. You can imagine him being a little concerned. But then, out of the silence, you get the disciples' question. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? How do you think the beggar would have felt about that? I imagine it would have hit him quite hard. Accused once again of sin, having all of his life not only been made to bear the shame of being blind, he also had to suffer the guilt for a sin that he had no knowledge of. But Jesus answered, it was not this man that sinned, or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. The words would have been quite a salve to this man. I think he would have felt quite relieved to hear those words. I don't believe that Jesus was saying that this man was born blind for a purpose, but rather that whenever disease or injury or misfortune occurs, there is scope for the work of God to be revealed. At this time, it was to be through Jesus. But the lesson that Jesus was, I believe, trying to give to his disciples was that it should also be at the hands of his disciples. And that's an exhortation for us too. We claim to be Jesus' disciples. So we should be doing the work of God. We should be seeing the scope in those people that need help. But the fact that they were asking the question actually begs another question, doesn't it? Why did Jesus' disciples ask this question? It's really quite an unusual question. We wouldn't ask that question, surely. As no single disciple was said to have asked the question, it was sort of like a collective query, something that the group had arrived at. So, why would they ask the question? Well, we see that it was part of the standard teaching at the time. When we read down a bit further in John chapter 9, we see the Pharisees actually quote this as a sort of principle, and they say, "You were born in utter sin, would you teach us?" So they are looking at the blind man and saying, "You were born in sin." So they're attributing his sin for no other reason that he was born in sin. They were attributing his blindness to the fact that he was born in sin. And so they cast him out. So it's most likely that the disciples had been taught this from their childhood. You know, they were brought up in the Judaistic system. They were part of the Sunday school of the time, if you like, and that's what they'd been taught. But what they had taught was clearly immoral. A child should not be punished for the sins of their parent. How could a child be made to bear the punishment all of their life for the sins of a parent? Or an unborn child. How could an unborn child be deemed to have sinned? They didn't know the law. They had no moral understanding. The child couldn't be deemed to have sinned. So what they had been taught within the Judaistic system was immoral. It was an immoral position. And it's an immoral position that reflects on God. So why wouldn't they question it? I think spending a bit of time with Jesus appealed to their moral awareness all the time. He was always appealing to he was trying to awaken their moral awareness. And I believe they saw in this proposition something that was immoral, and so they asked the question. And once again, that's an exhortation to us, isn't it, as Jesus' disciples. Having spent time with Jesus, we too should be aware of moral issues. We should be questioning moral issues. But it's an interesting thing that this principle had already been established in Job, and the book of Job is one of the oldest books of the Old Testament. So if they'd read the account of Job, they'd probably have better understood the principle. At the beginning of the book of Job, God actually testifies just how wonderful Job is. And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and an upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil?" Wow. Wouldn't we like God to say that of us? We'd love to hear that about ourselves. But when the tribulations came on Job, and Job was at his very lowest point, his friends came along and said, "You must have sinned. You're a sinful man. This is why all of this has come on you." We all know the story of Job. In the end, his friends are corrected. Job's exonerated. And Job himself has learnt something. He says, "My ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." My thanks to Paul Gresham for reminding me of that quote. And I think it's very salient to this, that even though Job was such a wonderful man, that he received God's approval, he still didn't know everything. He still didn't see God. Metaphorically, he was still blind to the character of God. He still saw God as being somewhat vengeful, providing punishments for a sin that he didn't know about. Okay? But he had learnt, in fact, of the grace and the love of God. And that's something for us too, that we should be opening our eyes, that we should be learning to understand things of a moral nature. Now, Paul writes this in Hebrews, assuming that it was Paul, that solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. As disciples of Christ, that's exactly what we should be doing. But it's interesting that Jesus' disciples provide an example for us. And like his disciples, we need to be open to not only to question, but to hear the answers. We have to be teachable. And Jesus teaches them in a way that opens their eyes. So just as Job's eyes had been opened, so the disciples' eyes had been opened. It's interesting, isn't it, that the first healing, in a way, in this account, is not the blind man, but the understanding of his disciples. That they had their eyes opened in the same way that Job had his eyes opened. So then he turns his attention to the blind man. I think it's rather significant that this man, and we find out later that he's not that he is actually a beggar. In the first part of the chapter, it just refers to him as a blind man, but it's significant that the beggar hasn't said a word. If you read through that, John chapter 6, you'll find that there is not a single word that the beggar says. All right, Jesus isn't revealed to him in any way. He didn't know who Jesus was. If he knew who Jesus was that was standing in front of him, the Son of God with all power, the great healer, he would have said, heal my sight, heal me. But he said nothing. He didn't know who Jesus was. Later on he says, he was just a prophet. So he didn't attribute any power or special ability to Jesus at this time. So in the silence, Jesus spits on the ground and makes some clay, then he wipes it on the blind man's eyes. Don't know about you, but if someone I didn't know spat on the ground and made some clay and put it on my eyes, I'd be a little bit insulted. It'd probably be a reflex that I'd wipe my eyes rather angrily and maybe go and find the nearest bit of water to wash my face in. But this man, this patient man, just said and did nothing. Jesus said to him, go and wash it off in the pool of Siloam and you'll receive your sight. He didn't complain. Even though there were pools that were much closer by. Okay, there were a number of pools close by. I haven't got it up there yet, but we pointed out 5 pools. The pool of Siloam was right down the bottom of the city. It was probably between 1.5 or 2 kilometres away from where they were. So it was a bit of a trek that Jesus was asking him to go on. He doesn't turn and say to Jesus, well, who do you think you are? He doesn't ask for Jesus' credentials. He didn't say, has anyone else been healed by this man? He didn't ask for any personal testimonies. There was nobody else there that gave him any encouragement. Nobody said, yes, he healed me. Go and do what he says. He had no evidence at all that he would in fact be healed. He just got up and headed off to the pool of Siloam. We shouldn't underestimate the size of the task that he had been given. He had to abandon his beggar's post, and that probably meant giving up any chance of an income to feed himself for the coming week. He had to travel from his position in the north to the pool of Siloam that was right across the other side of the city to the south. It was a long trek for a blind man. It was significantly more than a Sabbath day's journey. And it was not very straightforward. The streets and alleyways of Jerusalem were not straight lines. And it took him outside of the city walls. It required him to traverse an unfamiliar territory. It's interesting, isn't it, how the city walls have that big dent in them at the bottom. Down along this part here was actually destroyed in one of the many overthrows of Jerusalem. It was rebuilt later on by Agrippa, but at the time of Jesus that didn't exist, so he's well outside the city walls. So, yeah, it took him into unfamiliar territory. He's not familiar with it. He's there with his staff, picking his way along down alleyways, across open pavements, through predominantly Roman quarters, probably past the Hippodrome down there. Now, that's interesting in itself when you think about this being a Sabbath. On the Sabbath, the Roman forces would have probably had a day off, just about. Most of the Jews were tucked up at home, although not going very far. So that would have been their quiet day. And what would they do on their quiet day? Well, they'd probably be down at the Hippodrome down here for the local horse races. They're probably having a bit of a party time, revelling in the events. And you have this Jewish man, a blind man, with mud on his face, in unfamiliar territory, picking his way down past the Hippodrome down here. Do you think he might have been reviled? Do you think they might have jeered at him? I think they would have given him a hard time. I think it would have been very, very dangerous for him. In some respects, risking his life even. Of course, the pools have to be at a lower height, or they had to be in this day. It had to be lower than the rest of it, so he's going downhill all the way, but that probably meant picking his way down stone stairs with his staff. We all know that it's more tricky going down the stairs than it is going up the stairs, so it would have been a dangerous trip for him. It was a mission that probably tested the limits of his resolve, and I wonder how we might have done. Do you think we might have done as well? Given the enormity of the task that he'd been given, I wonder how any of us would have fared. I think it would have been probably too much to ask. I suspect that I may have just wiped my eyes, washed my face, and gone back to the begging. But this man gets up and sets off without a word to the pool. So why did he do that? He didn't know who Jesus was. He had no evidence that he would receive his sight. What was the driver of this enormous leap of faith? What was it that made him get up and go to the pool? I believe his only motivation was the incredibly slight chance that he might be healed. He hoped to be healed. Paul writes, or the writer to Hebrews says in Hebrews 11:1, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. His act of faith was the substance, the product of his hope. How do we know that he hoped? Because his act of faith was evidence of the unseen hope within him. What an example of blind faith. I think it's one of those things when we stop and think about it, how it should be for us that the hope that we have is the driver for the acts of faith. It should be the driver for our actions. There is a problem with evidence. And some people say that they won't or can't believe unless there is proof. To do so would be too gullible. And I can understand that. We all like a bit of certainty before we act. But refusing to believe that lives can be healed by Jesus without real and tangible evidence reveals a lack of enough hope to inspire their faith. And we see that in sorry, not quite ready for that one. Oh, here we go. The Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus to test him, and they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. And he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah." So he left them and departed. Really? We shouldn't want to have a sign? Wouldn't you like to witness a miracle? Or to see a prophecy fulfilled in so convincingly that you couldn't deny it? Asking for a sign, for clear evidence, is like saying, "I refuse to believe unless I really must." But if that was the case, then it would take no faith at all to believe. If you had absolute proof, there'd be no faith involved. Because faith, it's intrinsic to faith that there is this doubt, this risk. So paradoxically, evidence undermines faith, because an act of faith always entails risk. Trust is intrinsic to faith. But let's just come back to the method Jesus used to heal the blind man. Why did Jesus choose to heal this way? Why did he use the mud? I think that we would all agree that by the power vested in him by his Father, Jesus could have just put his hand on his shoulder, looked him in, well, probably not necessarily looked him in the eye because he was blind, and he could have said to him, "Receive your sight," and he would have been healed. I think we all believe that that would be the case, that Jesus' power was strong enough that he could have done that. But John gives us a bit of a clue as to why Jesus did this and what he was aiming to achieve. He says, then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and he washed and came back seeing. So it's a bit interesting, the pool of Siloam down here is an odd name, Sent, isn't it? Why would you call a pool Sent? Well, up here you've got the Gihon Spring, and in the time of Hezekiah, he actually got a tunnel built all the way as this blue line here. It's a very wiggly tunnel, not as shaky as my hand, but so the water that was down there was sent. It was sent from the pool of Siloam. So that's probably where it got its name from, I'm just assuming, but it sounds logical that that's why they would call the water sent. So it was very good of John to translate that for us from Siloam to sent, except that John didn't translate it from Siloam to sent because there wasn't any modern day English in the time. He actually translated it into Greek. And the word that he used to translate Siloam is apostello, from which we get the word apostle. He could have used other Greek words, but he used to choose one that carried an inference. And the inference is of one being sent forth on a mission, like an apostle, as a messenger. I think that's what John's trying to tell us, that the blind man was carrying a message. From the time that he was healed, he was no longer silent. But his witness to Jesus' power, which he provided by his actions, spoke even louder, travelling well beyond the Sabbath day to the pool and then returning. So he was bearing a message. And the message, of course, was for the Pharisees. So John has written this account in such a way as to draw a contrast between the actions of, in the first instance, a blind man who hoped to be healed, even though he had no evidence that this hope would be satisfied. A man who courageously stepped outside the law, outside the city walls, in faith because of his hope. And he's contrasting that with the Pharisees, who, in fact, received a watertight evidence. They received evidence that was unassailable. They had the man there who had been made to see. They checked that it was the right man. They checked his identity. They got his parents there. There was nothing that they could say that would undermine what had gone on. They had unassailable evidence. And the evidence was of the power of God working through Jesus to heal on the Sabbath day. But they were so keen to prove him wrong that they got his parents there to confirm his identity. They asked him to repeat his story as if they could catch him out on some detail. And in the end, they dismissed him as having been born in sin. The words of Jesus, quoting Isaiah, probably never more true. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You'll be ever hearing but never understanding. You'll be ever seeing but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. So what was the real difference? Why could the Pharisees not see when the blind man could? Well, it's this thing about hope. Hope always looks forward. And a fear of change always looks backward to how things have previously been. The Pharisees did not feel the need to be healed, to be corrected, to be enlightened. They were not looking forward. They had no hope. And by denying the need, they forfeited the chance to be healed. How would it be if the blind man complained that he had no evidence and refused to take the journey to the pool of Siloam? Would have been disastrous for him, wouldn't it? Wouldn't have affected anybody else, just him. How would it be if the blind man lacked hope? How would it be if our own hope lacked urgency and we were unable to act in faith? How would it be if Jesus' disciples were not discerning enough to question him? How would it be if we were so self-confident in our understanding that we too failed to question, to listen, and to hear? Now, God's grace is often revealed outside the city. And John highlights the difference in the behaviour of Jesus' disciples and the blind man and the Pharisees. He illustrates how some are open to learn, one hope to be healed, and some are defensive of their position. It's a lesson in vulnerability to us all. It's a call to abandon our false securities, both ecclesially and personally. The grace of God was seen in the healing of the man born blind. As we see in other events also, God's grace is revealed both outside city walls and beyond the boundaries of law. So what is it about city walls, and why is reliance on law wrong? Well, they're both a defence. City walls are a defence, and laws also can be used as a defence. City walls are for the weak. The strong don't need them. You know, when Israel attacked Jericho, they didn't have walls. The people inside Jericho did. They were the ones quaking in their boots. To be outside the walls is a mark of the strong. The people that attack the city, they're the strong ones. The weak ones are inside the city. Laws also can be used as a defence. The laws are for the lawless. The righteous don't need them. We may think that laws can only condemn, but they can also be misused to self-justify, like a defence for immoral behaviour or a defence against the need to do right. And we see this in the actions of the Pharisees. They provided justification for not helping the blind man or the needy on the Sabbath. The law provides them justification for doing nothing on the Sabbath. It's a justification for refusing aid to those that are deemed smitten by God. So they blamed the blind man as smitten by God, and that justified their not helping him. It's a justification for inequity, and we're all in danger of that, aren't we? It's a justification for cutting people off when we don't like what they say. Perhaps John is addressing us all. Putting trust in signs or evidence, or putting trust in walls or laws, all undermine the relationship of trust that we should have with God. It's a relationship that should be founded in hope, that in turn produces acts of faith. Stepping outside of our comfort zone, placing our trust in the power of God to heal and restore. Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. Through him, then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Thank you very much.